So this sermon is a pretty good glimpse into my brain. I had a real good feeling about what I was going to say, but I don't think I clearly actually figured out what it is that I was trying to get across. And I think that's pretty common. I think we know sometimes when we kind of read something in the Bible or have an experience in our lives that it means something. But I've really been struggling this week with what this passage means. But I think certainly the thing that I was clear about is the thing that struck me in the context of this sort of journey through Lent is the last two Sundays we've been talking about celebrations. Last week it was the prodigal son who comes back after breaking his father's heart and transgressing on all these rules, and the father gives this huge party, way out of proportion for what the son deserves. And again, this week, Mary offers up this offering to Jesus, a celebration to Jesus of this immensely expensive perfume that's kind of all out of proportion for what is probably called for. And the two things that kind of kept going through my head were this story that we're telling in Lent this year. It's a story about love, which is greater than transgression, and it's a story of joy that is greater than heartbreak. And so those were the kind of things that were going through my head. And to set the context, just again from the story from John, we have Jesus coming to Bethany on his way to Jerusalem. And for John, timing is everything. He's always setting things very clearly in a story. So Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. He knows he's on his way to his own death. He knows he's on his way to the crucifixion. And he comes to the home of Lazarus. And here he is anointed with oil that was being saved for his burial. So it's a very strange story. And to me, just incredibly rich, because here you have a story in which a man who was not long ago dead, risen from the dead, Lazarus, is hosting a dinner party, and that doesn't even warrant kind of a mention, right? Like, hey, Lazarus, you used to be dead, now you're having a party, that's great. That's not even an important part of the story. But yet there he is. He's sitting there, and I think sitting there for John is a symbol of what's to come, about coming back from the dead. And then you have Martha, who, again, is dutifully serving, right? She is tending to the food and serving everybody. And then you have Mary, who kind of breaks all the rules by doing this act that is beyond what is called for. Certainly at the time in Palestine, it wouldn't be uncommon for a woman to wash a man's feet, or for a slave more usually to wash a master's feet. It was something that was done. But the oil that is used, and the amount of money is very specific. It's 300 denarii, which is equivalent to a year's salary. So in our context, about $50,000 worth of perfume is used. And also that she uses her hair. This is a society in which men would very rarely have seen a woman's hair at all. It would have been covered, and yet she uses her hair to wash his feet with this incredibly expensive perfume. It's Judas who actually says the only negative thing about it, which is, why are you using that oil? You could have sold that and given it to the poor. And John is interesting. He could not have known why Judas Iscariot says this, but he says, Judas is a thief, and he just wants to take the money for himself. It's again strange that John would choose to do that. And in the end, Jesus says, nope, it's okay what she did. That, Judas, you're right, that money could have been used for something else, but in the end, you're always going to have the poor, but you're not always going to have me. And I just thought, you could have written a sermon on any of those things. What does it mean to minister to Jesus as opposed to minister like Jesus? I mean, Jesus is actually having his feet washed here. What does it mean to say, you'll always have the poor, but you will not always have me? There's a great sermon in that. But in the end, I think what I wanted to talk about was a sense of disproportionality, that in the readings we've seen in Lent so far, people are doing things beyond what is called for. going outside of their normal roles and doing things that are extravagant. The father and the prodigal son, Mary here today, are marking these moments, are doing these celebrations that are out of all context, that would make us uncomfortable, I think. And what is it in that transgression, in that celebration beyond what is called for, that might bring us closer to God? And that to me is, I think going into this week, what I knew I wanted to talk about, and I've felt like I've really struggled to make it clear, which leads me to hockey. Because, I don't know, maybe it's because I've been coaching hockey lately, but it struck me that one of my favorite moments from the early part of this season was Neil Yakupov, who is a new rookie for the Edmonton Oilers, or one of my favorite teams. They had an early season game, and the Oilers have been pretty bad for a few years, but there's some expectations this year. And in an early season game, they were playing the Los Angeles Kings, who are the defending Stanley Cup champions, a real chance to kind of see where the Oilers were at. And in a game that was very well played, it was tied going into the last few seconds, and Neil Yakupov scores a beautiful goal. And the kid's 18 years old. And then he does this crazy celebration that actually there must have been 3 weeks of blogs about it, and the internet was all on fire about what this kid did after he scored his goal. And it was such a big issue in the NHL that actually Don Cherry weighed in, and here's Don Cherry talking about that. You know what's a serious issue when Don Cherry weighs in? And there was something in that story that reminded me of Mary and the prodigal son. And I think it's this, that we have a real sense of decorum in our society. We have a real sense of proportionality, that we know by what bounds we should act. And sometimes when somebody like Neil Yakupov or Mary or the prodigal son's father breaks those things wide open, it really hits a nerve with people. And so that was kind of what I saw in the Yakupov celebration. There was another video, and for those of you who don't go on the internet, it would have proved everything that you think is wrong with the internet. And for those of you, it would have been obvious. But I don't know if anybody remembers the double rainbow video. It's a guy in California who sees a double rainbow and goes on for 7 minutes to weep and moan and say, "Oh my God, it's so beautiful, what does it mean?" And it's 7 minutes. That video had almost 1 billion hits. People from all over the world couldn't get enough of this, and it was because it was funny. They were laughing at this guy who was having this seizure of wonder over this double rainbow. And I thought, again, it's about proportionality. Nobody would have said, it wouldn't be funny if he just would have said, "That's a beautiful double rainbow." And it wouldn't be an issue for Don Cherry if Neil Yakupov had scored a goal and said, "Yeah, that was a good goal." Or it wouldn't have been an issue for Judas Iscariot if Mary would have just taken a cloth and wiped his feet. Or the prodigal son with his big party for somebody who's broken all the rules. The problem is, in our society, sometimes we want our celebrations to be small. We want them to fit within the context of our own lives. And I think there's a message coming through in Lent that maybe breaking that open is something that we need to do. So back to Mary. In thinking about the passage, what's interesting is John is very specific about the amount of money. He says, "Why didn't you sell the nard? Why didn't you sell this perfume for 300 denarii and give it to the poor?" So that's roughly $50,000 today. And I thought, wow, can you imagine, well, one, having $50,000 to spend on perfume, or two, actually using the money for that? It is a really strange and extravagant act just to own that, and then to take it and have it for a very specific purpose. Jesus says, "She bought this for me for the day that I die, for my burial." So Jesus knows that Mary has bought this, and it's supposed to mark his body when he's done as a very important person. To have nard at the time of your burial was a sign of being very wealthy and very respected, very important. So she has this nard for this moment. In her head, she knows what she's going to do with it. And yet when she sees Jesus with Lazarus and Martha at this dinner, All that is thrown out the window, and she takes it, and she puts it on his feet, and not content just to throw $50,000 worth of perfume on his feet, she then unbinds her hair and cleans his feet with her hair. I mean, it really is a shocking sort of intimate, subservient act. And yet, Jesus allows it to happen. Judas says, you shouldn't do that because we could use the money better. But Jesus says, no, the poor will always be there. You won't always have me. He allows this act to happen. So we know that Jesus finds it okay. So then the question that comes to me is what are we supposed to take from this? I mean, this is interlectionary. This is what we're supposed to be reading Lent this year. And maybe the question is, what does our own sense of proportionality, does our own sense of how things ought to be, hold us back from some experience of God that maybe the story of Mary and maybe the story of the prodigal son is trying to get to us? And we know within our own context what's appropriate. When we're invited to a dinner party, we know that we're supposed to bring a small gift. Usually bring a bottle of wine, or you offer to make the salad, or you bring flowers. When you get a ride to Thunder Bay, you usually offer to pay some of the gas cost. At Christmas time, we'll often say we're going to have a Secret Santa, but we're going to keep a $20 lift on $20 on gifts, and that's it. And we do that because we have this great accounting between one another, that we know we need to be kind of even. We want to hold our own, and we don't want to be embarrassed that we've given too little, but we don't want to be embarrassed that we're receiving too much either. That we don't often talk about those kind of unspoken rules, but we know what's appropriate in terms of giving and receiving and celebrating. And so I was trying to think, what would Mary's gift look like in our context here in Marathon? And I thought, would it be something like, Judy offers me, come over to my house for dinner, and I come over, and as a parting gift, she gives me a new truck, or fishing boat? That would be actually Colin's fishing boat would be, or a dining room set, and I thought, that's not quite right, because in the story, Jesus doesn't leave with anything. I mean, except for slippery feet. The thing that's given is essentially thrown onto the ground. This $50,000 gift is gone. And so I thought, okay, it's not that. It's not a gift that you can take with you. And so I was trying to think a leprechaun breath was as close as I could come for the kids. But I was thinking for us, it would probably be something like if we were really ill and needed a transfusion or an organ or something, and somebody we didn't really know were to give that to us. That is kind of the kind of thing I think that we're getting at here. It's this debt you can't repay, this incredibly intimate connection that binds you together, and something that's given that's so immense. When my father was in his 50s, his little sister got lymphoma, and she needed a complete bone marrow transplant. And so he did that for her. And it was, a gift that saved her life. And I remember getting phone calls and just thinking it was very funny. She would call to say, "Ted, what are we allergic to?" Because they had the same immune system now because of that transfusion. I thought, that's the kind of intimacy that Mary's creating with this kind of act. And then, obviously, among family, we'd have no problem doing that. But what would that look like if that were to come from a stranger or to come from someone we barely knew? And that, I think, puts the act of Mary into context. And more than that, I think most of us can sort of understand being Mary in this story. When we think about it, if Jesus or if somebody who's really important to us or were present, we could give that sort of thing pretty freely. As Christians, I think we're good at giving. It's kind of what we do. But it struck me that Jesus is allowing this incredibly strange act to occur to him. That he is saying, first of all, it's okay that in a group that I said should espouse poverty, somebody has a $50,000 block of perfume. Two, that I'm okay with the fact that she's already bought it for my burial, which is a little weird. And I'm okay that she's going to pour it out on my feet, unbind her hair, and rub it into my feet. kind of with everybody around. And I thought, we often say that we want to walk like Jesus or minister like Jesus. But this is actually a case of what ministering to Jesus would look like. I mean, Jesus is the one who is accepting this. And I think there's a real challenge there to say, when we are offered that sort of intimacy by others, when we are offered that sort of love of God, that stuff that makes you feel almost embarrassed in your heart, that we need to be open to that. And we need to be willing to accept that kind of love. It can't just be giving. That there needs to be a space to accept as well. And I would find it more difficult to be Jesus in this story than Mary, certainly. And the message I guess I came to in the end is something like this, that our response to the gift of Jesus and God's gracious love is not proportional. It doesn't need to be proportional. Sometimes our acts, our celebrations can be outside of all good judgment, and that they can still lead us to a place that's close to God and maybe closer to God. And I think we've seen that in Mary. I think we've seen that in the prodigal son. And I would argue that we see that in Neil Yakubov, that sort of just exuberant celebration of the moment, of the presence of goodness in your life. Sometimes it's important just to throw caution to the wind and really allow that sort of wonder to be present. The other thing, obviously, that came to mind too was St. John's has chosen radical intentional hospitality as our mission. And I think the story of Mary today shows us what that might look like. Her act as an act of hospitality. You have a stranger coming to your house. Washing feet is one of the ways you welcome people. But this incredible intimacy, this incredible extravagance, this choice to act outside of conventional norms in the presence of Christ, Mary shows us what that radical hospitality might actually look like. And in the season of Lent, as people of St. John, we might look at this moment and wonder, what could our acts of hospitality in the coming year look like? How could we actually become really radical and intentional in hospitality? And then also to challenge ourselves not to be constrained by a sense of proportion or a sense of being proper. That the readings in our Lenten journey are certainly telling us that the holy exists at the margins, in the places where our celebrations might lead us to, and to be open to seeing what's out there at the fringe. So that was, I think, the message I was trying to get from the reading today.